Welcome to Movie Menu Classics, your go-to podcast for classic cinema. I'm your host, Heather.
And I'm Vasthi.
And each episode, we will be having a spoiler-free discussion of our favorite classic films. We'll also be sharing why we recommend these films, along with some fun facts. So join us while we talk about the classics that we love. On today's episode, we're actually going to be discussing just one film, and that film is Gone with the Wind. Vasthi, take it away.
So, Gone with the Wind, available on HBO Max with a video intro and also on Amazon Prime with the disclaimer. I picked Gone with the Wind this time because I feel like over the years it's one of those films that is revered and we don't always understand why. And personally, for me, I feel every single moviegoer should see this. And just for a historical perspective as to why the Southern culture is trying to understand the Southern culture and why it was romanticized the way it is, and just trying to understand that time in history leading up to from Reconstruction through the Jim Crow laws to the beginning of Hollywood cinema and just the grandiose production of this. It's just, I think it's so multi-layered that it needs to be shown repeatedly. And I'm not to say it's one of my favorites. I find parts of the story really insufferable by a certain character, but we'll discuss that later. But I just feel like the layers that this film has in terms of production as well as story is really important. So what were your first impressions before we get into the details and the technical aspects of the film?
So I hadn't seen this film since I was a kid. I don't know if we talked about it on the podcast last time, but I saw it when I was little. Once or twice, but the most specific memory I have of watching it is my parents took me to go see it in theaters, but I was like 6 or 7. I was way too young. Yeah, to try to sit through this 4-hour movie. So I just remember it being agony. So I have the kind of that like ingrained in me that I like, there's a seed in there that I hate this film. So I was excited to watch it with fresh, clean eyes as, and, you know, an adult. And really, and then this film is so, like you said, not only is the period romanticized, but the film is romanticized. And I even I have this inbred nostalgia for this movie. You know, Gone with the Wind, it's one of the most beloved classic films, one of the most popular films of all time. So
everybody knows the line.
Yeah, the most famous line in the movie, which almost didn't happen because the censors didn't want him to say, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." Damn was apparently too risque.
Vulgar.
Yeah. But so a lot of this film was uncomfortable to watch. I mean, it really, it was uncomfortable. It was just a little unsettling, and it was weird. I mean, we'll definitely dive into like just the skipping over slavery and just the horrible, awful depictions, racial depictions of the characters in this film. Just like you said, romanticizing is the perfect word of the culture of the South. In the movie, I remember when the film started, I was like, Gone with the Wind, what does that even mean?
Oh yeah, and within the first 30 seconds, you're like, oh my god.
Yeah, well, it explains that Gone with the Wind, like our beloved Southern culture is just gone with the wind. And it was just so strange. It took me a while, like, you know, this is a 4-hour movie. And I think it took me like 2 hours intermission about when I was finally over the fact that this was from a Southern point of view, and that was so strange to me.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you. This film is really important to watch because it does give as much as there are some definite historical inaccuracies, but a lot of just kind of glazing over some things. What I feel the historically accurate parts are how the Southerners felt about it. And that's an interesting perspective that we don't normally have. So,
well, especially as like a completely, this Californian culture that I was raised in, I do not understand the attachment to some of the Southern cultural aspects that are still controversial today. That's Southern.
Yeah, the customs, the heritage, the
what I don't understand. But this film it forces me to think about those things instead of just scoffing at people who still defend the Confederate flag or think about it as this cultural significant thing in their lives. For me, it's a glimpse, even if it's not the most accurate glimpse, but
yeah, it's definitely an interesting perspective that I believe people really should watch. I really agree with you. This film needs to be watched. It needs to be discussed.
Absolutely.
And I think it explains some things about the South perspective and why, because in this film they depict that the Southerners were excited about the Civil War, that war could be coming. And I think I don't know, you're the history or the historian, I should say. But I feel like as far as the history that I know, that they were excited about the war. They really thought they could destroy us. And some of the characters bring up, like, I don't know, they have industry that we don't. We don't have the supplies. We have money, but we don't have the infrastructure to support a war or the people. So it was just interesting, that perspective. Also, now if we take away, and I was trying to take away all the, like, historical elements and just like, hey, what is the basic story about, right? And the basic story, which I do appreciate that it's a female-driven story. It is about women, and it's Scarlett O'Hara's story, really. But she is insufferable. Completely insufferable. She's the worst character. She's just a manipulative, terrible. But there are fascinating things about her. It's an interesting character study because she is so manipulative, and you can watch her decide how she's going to go about a situation. She'll use anger, she'll use tears, she'll use flirting, anything she can to manipulate the situation to her advantage. And it's interesting watching her change tactics, and she definitely has a very strong character arc throughout this, and in a lot of ways, and then in some ways she doesn't. She's just an immature child. So I don't know how I feel about this film.
I think that's a perfect description, because as soon as so this was Brad's first time watching it all the way through. He'd only seen bits and pieces of it. For those who don't know, Brad's my husband. And immediately after the film ended, he turns to me and says, like, is this on your favorites list? I was like, no. This is on my top 25 list, but it is not my favorite by any means. I just think it's an important film to watch and discuss, especially because it has such a strong hold in our cinematic history. And I just need to make that very, very clear. This is not a favorite film of mine, but I think it is a very important film to keep revisiting, especially. I mean, there's always going to be especially in every decade, but it's a discussion that's still relevant today. I mean, even just a couple of months ago, there's a big uproar on HBO Max just wanting to put a video intro on people. I mean, I admit I might have overreacted to, like, they shouldn't be taking it away. No. They just needed a minute to figure out how to introduce this film, which I think more films should be introduced in the very, Turner Classic Movie way.
Yeah, so they actually, with the controversy that, because of the strengthening of the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd, this movie kind of got thrown into the mix as it should be taken down, and there was a lot of debate about it. But like you said, HBO decided to take it down and come up with an introduction. So they actually used Turner Classic Movies host, and she's a film scholar. Her name's Jacqueline Stewart. And when on HBO, and you can watch it on YouTube. I watched it on YouTube, but they have like a 5-minute introduction, like what you should know going into this.
Which I actually thought was perfect.
Yeah, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I always love the TCM intros anyway, but I think this was a really good way. This is a great way to frame the film, like what you should know going in. And she says, quote, why this 1939 epic drama should be viewed in its original form, contextualized and discussed. So I think that is really important. Like, we should understand what we're looking at, and we should watch it because it is really good historical information. And then, you know, even when it's made in 1939, we're looking at what Hollywood and what people, what concepts they had about history. So it's very relevant, historical, cultural, significant film. And plus it's epic in its production quality. It's an actual film. I mean, the money and the time and the effort.
Oh, and the cinematography's gorgeous. Yeah.
And it was a groundbreaking film, so it's very important to film history. But it's nice to have some context and some discussion going in to this film. She also goes on to say, which I'm bringing up some quotes that I felt were really important from her introduction, which I definitely recommend our audience goes and checks out. Like I said, it's 5 minutes. There's also a hour-long discussion that they had at a 2019 film festival for TCM. I didn't have a chance to watch it, but it's definitely on my to-do list.
I want to watch that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, check it out, and then we'll talk about it. Our audience should check it out and talk about it, too. She goes on to say, Gone with the Wind presents the antebellum South as this is a quote, by the way, the antebellum South as a world of grace and beauty without acknowledging the brutalities of the system of chattel slavery upon which the world is based. Also, the enslaved black people in Gone with the Wind conform to old racial stereotypes, quote, as servants notable for their devotion to their white masters or for their ineptitude. And Stewart says, the film's treatment of this world through a lens of nostalgia denies the horrors of slavery as well as its legacies of racial inequality. So I thought those were very important words.
Oh, it's perfect. Sorry to throw Brad under the bus, but he started to fast forward it. I was like, no, we have to watch the introduction. Like, this is what makes these films important and relevant and explains understand why something like this could have been made as, you know, we've progressed as a society, or, you know, we hope we've progressed as a society. Why even something like this might have been seen as progressive even at the time, and just try to understand why that was at that moment. So no,
it was contested though. Even at the time, there were protests and
we'll get into that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. and real quick, also, I watched it on Amazon, not HBO, and they added a still of a disclaimer, and it's really short, but it says Gone with the Wind, 1939. It's a product of its time and depicts racial and ethnic prejudices that have unfortunately been commonplace in American society. These racist depictions were wrong then and are wrong today. To create a more just, equitable, inclusive future, we must first acknowledge and understand our history. This picture is presented as it was originally created, and I believe that is short and sweet and to the point, and I really agreed with this, which is why I wanted to quote it also.
Yeah, I watched it on HBO Max, but I'm happy that there is like a concise disclaimer for the Amazon Prime viewers. So for the Brads of the world that won't fast forward. Okay, so with that, we'll start our official discussion. So Gone with the Wind was released on January 17th, 1940. It is not rated. It was the official direction credit is given to Victor Fleming. However, we're going to discuss about the other two directors that were also involved in this. The screenplay is credited to Sidney Howard, and here's the plot. A manipulative woman and a roguish man conduct a turbulent romance during the American Civil War and Reconstruction periods. Yeah, that's the plot, according to IMDb. So
all 4 hours summed up into a sentence. Pretty
One
accurate.
sentence.
I mean, it's 12 years in the life of some characters, specifically Scarlett. But yeah.
So it's starring Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh, Thomas Mitchell, Barbara O'Neill, and Hattie McDaniel. So, 1939, just to paint a brief picture of what was going on in the world before we get into the film discussion. The New York's World's Fair opened. Lou Gehrig retires from Major League Baseball. Hitler was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize.
What?
Though it was
Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea that was a thing.
It was a thing.
I'll look into
Although
that.
his nominator claims that it wasn't meant to be taken serious. And I'm like, oh, where does that sound familiar? War of the Worlds was broadcast. The New York Times predicted that TV would fail because Americans wouldn't be able to sit still and just watch TV. The last thing the BBC aired before going off air was a Mickey Mouse cartoon, and World War II began. 1939 was also the year that several blockbusters came out, along with Gone with the Wind. There was also Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Wizard of Oz, Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It was by 1940 for the Oscar ceremony. It had won 8 Best Picture. 8 Academy Awards. 1 for Best Actress for Vivian Leigh. Best Supporting Actress Hattie McDaniel, who was also the first African American woman to win an Oscar.
She was the first African American to be nominated or win an Oscar, actually.
Best Director Victor Fleming. Best Screenplay, Best Cinematography in Color, Best Art Direction, Best Editing, and Best Picture. And was also given another Technical Achievement Award. The only awards it didn't win was for Clark Gable. And when you hear his Best Actor category, you're like, wow, it was a stacked category that year. So he was up against Laurence Olivier, Mickey Rooney, Jimmy Stewart, and they all lost to Robert Donat for Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It didn't win for Best Score, who also lost to The Wizard of Oz. Best Supporting Actress Olivia de Havilland ended up losing to Hattie McDaniel, and it also lost Best Sound Recording. But essentially, it kind of swept the Oscars that year. The ceremony was held at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles at the Coconut Grove, and the ceremony was segregated. The hotel had a no coloreds policy, so technically Hattie McDaniel wasn't invited to go to her own ceremony. But as an exception to David O. Selznick, who was the head of the studio at the time, an exception was made, and she was allowed to sit in the back of the room, but she couldn't be with her co-stars. So where, the Academy thought they were being progressive by making an exception, it's a terrible thing to even try to understand that.
Yeah, and actually the premiere in Atlanta was segregated also.
Oh yeah, I'll get into the premiere for sure.
Yeah, she wasn't allowed to go to that either.
Nor the other.
I want to backtrack for 1 second real quick to the starring. I know we looked at this earlier and then we just talked about it, but this is kind of wrong because the lead is Vivian Leigh for sure because she's the main character, and then Clark Gable, but then the other 2 romantic leads are Olivia de Havilland and Leslie Howard, and then Hattie McDaniel. So Thomas Mitchell and Barbara O'Neill were actually Scarlett's parents, which are much smaller ensemble characters.
Yes, and by the way, I as a fellow fan of It's a Wonderful Life, I'm like, did you recognize who her father was?
Yeah, and also...
I'm like, oh, that's always going to be Uncle Billy.
Yeah. it was definitely Uncle Billy. And then I just watched, speaking of It's a Wonderful Life, super side note, not related to this at all, but I just watched The Bishop's Wife last night, and one of the little extras characters, a small scene, is young George Bailey. I was like, George Bailey. So I had a lot of It's a Wonderful Life in the last, 24
hours. So quickly, back to finishing off the Oscar ceremony that year. So something interesting that I mentioned earlier, that Mickey Rooney was also nominated alongside Clark Gable. So, for classic movie fans, you know that Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland often had a lot of films together. They were only 2 years apart. So while Mickey Rooney was nominated for Best Supporting Act or Best Actor, that was the same year that Judy Garland was presented with a special juvenile Oscar. And I suspect it's because she wasn't 18 yet. But for her role in The Wizard of Oz, she should have been nominated for Best Actress.
Is Mickey Rooney older or younger?
2 years older. But I think it was just before she turned 18, but still, that's kind of a load of crap, I think.
And now they'll nominate kids just in the category.
Yeah.
There's not a special juvenile category.
But I believe that's the only time they've done that. It all happened in the same year, so really interesting to know that Gone with the Wind, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and The Wizard of Oz were all competing against each other in several of these categories. And just a random fun fact for those locals, the Ambassador Hotel was demolished in 2006.
Oh, wow, recent.
So as far as the productions, I mentioned earlier that there were 3 directors. George Cukor, I might botch that name. He was fired after the first 18 days, or 18 days into shooting. That's when Victor Fleming came in for 93 days.
And the bummer is the first guy, which you just said his name, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but he spent 2 years in pre-production working on this film, and he lasted 3 weeks.
Into the shooting, that's awful. So Victor Fleming, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe he also directed The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, he had just gotten done filming that, and he jumped over to this, so he was exhausted.
And I think it was a mental breakdown that he suffered, why he had to drop out after 93 days.
Well, I read that he took a break, and that's when they brought in, what was the other guy, Sam Wood?
Sam Wood.
So he, helped out. But, I read somewhere that Cukor was actually reportedly fired because he was gay.
Oh!
And so there was there's a lot of rumors, nothing's for sure, but even though the producer guy, I forget his name, Selznick or something, David Selznick, I want to say, he and Cukor had worked together a lot, but I guess Clark Gable's past was a little iffy, and he had gone around in some certain circuits, and George Cukor had known a little bit of his past from being in the same circles, so Clark Gable reportedly was really uncomfortable with this, so that's the reason he was fired. So this is supposedly, this is rumors.
But you know what? I could believe it. I mean, I've heard of people getting fired for just hearsay before, so
yeah, and
I could believe that. Yeah,
the producer was like, well, because he's gay, he's not going to be able to properly direct the love scenes. Although, even though he was dismissed, Vivian Leigh and Olivia de Havilland went to him privately on the side and didn't tell Selznick and Fleming, but they got coaching from him.
That's perfect.
He was still involved almost the whole time, but just from the background. But so this is all rumors, hearsay, but I did see it in multiple places, so take it or leave it. Interesting.
I could believe it. Absolutely. Another little tidbit I found was that F. Scott Fitzgerald tried his hand at writing the screenplay, and so did about 15 others. Unsuccessfully. Apparently, he's not given any credit for it, but I thought that was interesting. Vivian Leigh is actually English and beat out over 1,400 women who auditioned for Scarlett O'Hara, which was protested by the United Daughters of the Confederacy for choosing a British actress over an American one.
Okay, so I read an interesting theory about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So one theory was that the reason they auditioned all these women was that Selznick had actually already picked her to be Scarlett. But because of the controversy of her being British and relatively unknown at the time, they had this publicity stunt of auditioning all these actresses to find the right Scarlett, even though they already knew who they were going to pick. So this was apparently all just show to like, and also it was to build hype and get the audience excited. So they had a widely publicized casting fiasco. It was all in the paper, so it was getting people hyped up about wanting to see this film. So apparently that could have all just been a ploy and they already knew they were going to cast her.
Oh, I totally believe that. That just reminds me of when they were giving public casting calls for Selena back in the 90s, and I remember I'm like, they never intended on choosing some girl from off the street, you know? And then all of a sudden,
you know, J-Lo.
No, it was her the whole time. No, so I believe that's a common publicity stunt of these open casting calls, and I mean, I'm not in casting, but what you just described with how Vivien Leigh was picked is exactly how I imagine these public casting calls are conducted. Like, okay, let me believe I have a shot. So the premiere was at Lowe's Grand Theater in Atlanta, and the mayor declared a 3-day holiday and basically encouraged cosplay at the time for all Southern women to wear their hoop skirts and pantalettes and the whole 9 yards.
And the men are out there in their Civil War uniforms. Awesome. Confederate soldiers and ladies in hoop skirts. Sounds delightful.
Listen, I can't relate. I don't understand it. I try, but I couldn't help during some of these scenes just think of how ridiculous a woman's role in that time was.
Oh my goodness. This film is really important to look at how women were treated in society. It is fascinating and horrendous. I mean, women, if you were in mourning, there are all these rules about what women can and can't do and what a lady is and what a lady's not. And that's a really interesting aspect of this. And boy, I'm glad we've come a long way, because I would not be down for all those rules. Like, I just, nope. No.
I mean, technically speaking, neither was Scarlett as much as, I mean, we'll get into nitpicking at her character. But, so the mourning part you're talking about, there's this, I remember owning this, like, Guinness World Records book and seeing that famous scene of Scarlett and Clark Gable dancing together, her in the black dress, and not really understanding why that was so famous and scandalous. And so, like, I could appreciate that she wanted to dance to the beat of her own drum, but going off on what you said of, like, I have so many feelings. I have so many mixed feelings. My feelings for her, like, for every good thing or every brave thing she'd do, there's, like, 17 things that made me hate her.
I 100% agree, but that's really what makes her a really interesting character. I mean, you really...
Have you read the book?
No, I have not.
I haven't either.
We didn't talk about that, actually. This is based off a novel by... I can't even remember her name. And she's very private, apparently, and they wanted her to be involved, but I guess she gave, like... At the very beginning of production, she gave a note about the outside look of the plantation, like Tara, the plantation.
Oh, yes, I read that too. Yeah.
And they didn't listen, so she was just like, no, I'm done. Oh, it's Margaret Mitchell was the
Margaret Mitchell, yes.
Of the original Gone with the Wind novel.
So back to the premiere. So you can imagine 1940 in Atlanta. And it's, Jim Crow is full swing. So the black actors that starred in the movie couldn't even attend. And I think it was very calculated that this premiered there. This was the hype film for the South. I would imagine they knew it wasn't going to necessarily perform well if they opened it in LA or New York. It had to premiere in the South where there was still a lot of this mentality. It was very strong, and I can't imagine what that must have been like. I mean, there's certain scenes that in my modern mentality, I would kind of giggle at just out of disbelief. So say, within the first frame, you see slaves picking cotton, and then seeing, them talking about the Yankees are coming and hyping up the Confederates. And I could almost imagine the audience cheering at certain parts of this. So like when there's a Union soldier who comes by the Terra to loot, and Scarlett has to defend herself, I imagine there's all this hooting and hollering and cheering, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to be at the premiere as an outsider. For any reporters who, were observing this hype fest for the Confederate and for what was lost.
Yeah, and it's not that far from the Civil War. Like, it's still a generation. So there were actually
veterans, probably
old, Civil War veterans at the premiere. Also, I read somewhere that Martin Luther King Sr. was invited to the premiere, an exception, and a lot of people didn't want him to go, but he decided to go, and he took his son with him. So they were actually at the premiere of this film. But a lot of people were rather upset and said he wouldn't go, but he decided to go because he was invited. So I think that's really interesting. And I really wanted to do some more research into that. Like if there were any comments about what he thought and why he went. But I thought it was fascinating that they were there. And like people were upset that like the black actors in this film couldn't go. Like it was reported that Clark Gable was so upset that Hattie McDaniel couldn't attend that he almost boycotted the premiere. But
I read that they were friends. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess she convinced him he should go, but he was going to boycott the premiere unless she could go, which I thought was sweet, but
that's interesting because she has kind of a controversial, role in terms of like groundbreaking, where we see her as groundbreaking now. I think some of her contemporaries might have seen her maybe as like a sellout because she kept getting these roles of like that just furthered some of the stereotypes of like what am I trying to say? So, like, in Song of the South, she's in that film. I believe that was her last credited role. And it is kind of the opposite of the role she plays here, which is kind of like a mouthy, sassy mammy. Which, the two sides of it for me is like, wow, that's awesome that she won an Oscar portraying someone who's actually talking back to her employer, but at the same time is like I could see where people were wanting to protest this film, people that were involved with the NAACP, that it furthered more of the stereotypes of the conforming house servant, the very loyal.
Right, yeah. When everything falls apart, almost all the other servants, they call them servants. They don't really say slaves ever. They say servants. No, but we
all know, yeah.
Right, but all of the other servants ran away. But, Mammy and one of the men and what's her name's Prissy or something?
Prissy, I think.
I don't know.
Yeah.
She was played by, what's her name? Like Butterfly McGee or some really amazing name. She has an amazing name. But her character, the other young black slave, her character was horrendous in the sense that she's just like this completely inept, idiotic, like
simple.
Yeah, simple. That's the word. She's just like this simple person that just doesn't understand. I mean, it's just horrible. And she had that high, squeaky voice and just dumb. And it was sad. And I felt, I don't know, it made me uncomfortable. Also, before I forget, there's a scene where all the women are napping. All the white ladies are taking a nap. Because that's what you do. All the women are wearing corsets and big dresses. So the men smoke cigars and drink brandy. And the women go upstairs and nap. And they're all lounging around on these couches. Being fanned by young black children. It was so uncomfortable and just...
It's uncomfortable, but I'm glad they included it at the same time. Like, to me, it made the women that much more ridiculous.
Yeah. They're being fanned with, like, giant plume fans made out of peacock feathers. Apparently her name was Butterfly McQueen and her character name was Prissy. Isn't that the coolest name ever, by the way?
It's like hippie before it was cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Butterfly McQueen. That's badass.
Something I like about... so Leslie Howard, who plays Ashley Wilkes, I read that he didn't like the way he was cast. Like, he's supposed to be this 21-year-old handsome man. And when I read that, I'm like, oh, that makes so much more sense. Like... Not to be superficial, but, like, I didn't really get it. You know, what was the obsession?
Yeah, it's true.
Ashley.
Scarlett is obsessed with this Ashley character, and he thought, and he was right, like, he's a little old for the character. Also, creepy, the Clark Gable looks like, in the very first scene when they meet, Clark Gable and, Scarlett and Rhett meet for the first time. Scarlett's like 16 and he looks like he's like 50.
56.
Yeah. It was like kind of cringeworthy, honestly.
One quote that I read from Leslie Howard, who plays Ashley, is he didn't even like the film. He says, quote, "It is a terrible lot of nonsense and heaven help me if I ever read the book." I mean, I kind of want to read it, but, I don't know. Reach out to us if you have read it, and should we, or is the film enough?
Apparently there's a lot of things that are glossed over.
Okay.
Like, for instance, a specific example was the chapters with, like, the Ku Klux Klan in the book. Oh. So you know how the men go to break up that encampment?
Yes.
The film glosses over the fact that in the book, they're wearing Klan hoods.
That makes more sense. And for me, like, I filled in the blank. I'm like, oh, I bet you they're, it's a meeting of a type of... I wasn't sure if it was exactly the KKK, but I'm like, oh, I could see this leading to something like that. Like, the root of it, if that makes sense. I didn't even put that together. It makes sense looking back. Yeah.
But watching it, I did not put together that, like, oh, that was a Klan meeting. Because they talk about, like, vigilante justice, but in the South, at the time, after the Civil War, that would have been
for sure
Klan justice.
Oh, yeah. So I'm wondering... So I read that there were several protesters, even in pre-production, and also protesting in D.C. or Pittsburgh during the premiere of the film. So I'm wondering if... So something that kept coming up for me during this research was that a lot of people were afraid that this was going to be glorifying the KKK like Birth of a Nation did. That film by D.W. Griffith. So I'm wondering if that was taken out because of those protests. Like, please don't glorify the KKK, because it would have given them some sort of sympathy had they shown that. Because, yeah, I mean, you see one of them get shot, you're like, oh, that's... I mean, the entire narrative is very pro-Confederate, and I mean, I couldn't help but just kind of scoff to myself, like, screw them, you know?
It was interesting to find myself having empathy for the characters, because you're naturally drawn into a story. These are the protagonists that you're following, so you're naturally going to empathize with their position and their struggles. But then you're like, wait a minute, yeah, these people are awful. I don't agree with their viewpoints. But if you take yourself out of that and just go along with the protagonist of the story you're being presented, then yeah, it was interesting to have a sympathetic narrative. And it was, I can't imagine the horrors for just the people that lived there at the time. And it is an interesting look at what it was like to live through the Civil War and what it was like to live through Reconstruction from that perspective of everything. And, you know, you grow up in this culture, right? So like Scarlett's character, she's born into this culture, and then it is literally burnt down to the ground around her. And what is that like? Even though we don't, modernly, we don't agree with this particular culture, but it is, you know, you can definitely empathize with her having her entire world destroyed and what that means to her, and have, you know, how does she fight back from that? I can empathize with the character. It's an interesting perspective.
It's a universal theme of wanting to protect your home. So I also felt sorry for her. It was hard for all the reasons we've already discussed, but I did, as kind of borderline cringe and borderline amazing as that scene in the last part of the first act was, when she's declaring that she's never going to go hungry again. And she basically tells everybody, the audience, like, whatever I have to do to survive, I'm going to do. Like, nothing is off limits. So we can't... So as shocked as we are with the things that she ends up doing to save Tara, to save her home and the family around her, she warned us that everything was off limits. And what would we do ourselves in order to survive? I think it's an interesting question.
Definitely.
We'd like to think we wouldn't do certain things, but when push comes to shove, who's to say? That said, I still judged her for a lot of it.
Yeah, her means and motives is still a little like, I don't, even though she's the one I'm following in this story, I don't necessarily like this person. But she was very brave in a lot of ways. She was very strong. She fought against the, like, women's oppression in the sense where she was just not down to be put in the back seat like that. Like, society wanted women in the back seat, and she was like, nope, I'm driving. And I appreciate that about her. She was a strong female character. Her
business savvy, you know.
Very, very much so. She was very smart in a lot of ways, and she knew how to use what she had. She knew how to use her beauty, her influence over people. Except the one person that she struggled to manipulate, and why they had such an interesting romance, is Rhett Butler, because he could see through her, and that's what made them such an interesting, fiery romance. And it's funny, this is like such a love story,
because it's really not.
Yeah, it's always talked, you know, the nostalgia of this film is it's like the greatest love story. The trailer even talks about like a love story you'll never forget or something like that, but I don't really see this as a love story. It's also like a very depressing film in a lot of ways. There's a lot of horrible things that happen. And
yes,
their romance is very, in a 4-hour movie, it is few and far between. And it's very tumultuous. it's interesting that we think of and whenever we see clips from it, it's always the two of them holding each other, and it's not really like that at all.
No, and it's an interesting study on obsession and how you can waste years obsessing over a person while your entire life is kind of flashing before your eyes. And I just, in my youth, friends of mine, myself, like, it's so easy to, like, become obsessed with the idea of somebody, not necessarily that person. And you see her having that realization of, like, oh, I was in love with an idea, not necessarily a person. And I found that to be relatable in, like, an immature sense of growing up. When you have that young love, you become fixated on one person. And I think that's something, maybe not to the, no, I won't say maybe, definitely not to the extent that she does, but I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to at one point during their youth. And it's just, for me, watching it as, a grown adult who has outgrown some of those tendencies that she shows, that she stays fixated on, is kind of laughable now, but only because there's a bit of experience that comes with that. And so, like, as I was talking to some of my friends, I'm like, this really is sort of like the godmother of, like, those horrendous rom-com films or bad TV, like Sex and the City, where a woman becomes obsessed with a man over a course of X amount of years that is no good for her.
Or just falling for someone who's completely unavailable emotionally or physically.
Yes.
And then that becomes
I will bring in the Sex and the City analogies all day with this, because I'm like, oh my god, she's the original Carrie Bradshaw and Clark Gable's and Mr. Big.
It was fascinating to me that even though she seems so immature and so shallow with a lot of things, especially the way her character is initially presented, yet when she really has a deeply held belief or love, like her love for Ashley or her love for Tara, which we keep talking about Tara. If you haven't seen the film, Tara is, like, all the plantations had names. So Tara is the name of the plantation that, like, the O'Hara plantation, the plantation that Scarlett grew up on, is her home. So that's why we keep referring to Tara, if you didn't know. But like, her love for Tara, and it as much as she has all these shallow motivations for doing things, like, I was impressed with her deeply held loves. Like, if she really felt strongly about something, even though she was a very materialistic person, it really all came down to fighting for those things that she loved, even if it didn't make sense or that was immature in itself. Like, she really stuck to her guns when she believed in something, and she's a very fascinating character, definitely.
It's for sure fascinating, because there were parts where, let me be clear, for the majority of the movie, I'm just, like, rolling my eyes, like, I'm like, oh my god, but then at the same time, I have to reel it in and think, no, she's a product of her time. She's born into, having whatever she wanted, having the beauty, even, like, she knew she had this power over her sisters, who also were born into this culture, but she knew she had every man at her palm, just eating out of her hands. So this is also kind of like a study of just wanting what she couldn't have. And so with Tara being taken away, or being threatened being taken away from her, she wasn't going to let anybody else take it. Had she been given the choice, I feel maybe she would have in another circumstance, she'd been like, I don't care about Tara. I want to, get out of here. But because it became a survival and it became an issue of life and death.
Yeah, and even though she was very immature, when it came down to it and the responsibility of being the head of household fell on her shoulders, she did step up to the plate in a big way. And she physically worked hard to survive. And that was, it's impressive.
I'm really interested in reading the book now, actually, the more we talk about it. Because, so in the hospital scene where she just kind of like pieces out, she's like, I'm over it. And you can imagine, I mean, when you enlist as a volunteer as a nurse during wartime, you're a soldier. You don't abandon ship. So I would be interested to know if that was seen as cowardly by other wartime nurses,
But then I can also see just from her standpoint how absolutely overwhelming that was. It's just insurmountable and just endless amounts of men dying, maimed, bleeding out, and there's no supplies, there's no medication. I mean, it just that constant horror. I can imagine the smell. She talks about the smell of death.
Well, let's talk about, we haven't talked about her polar opposite, Olivia de Havilland's character, Melanie.
Oh, and their relationship is so fascinating because Scarlett hates her, but Melanie loves her, and it's fascinating.
Is essentially who we all want to be in terms of good, and not in terms of naivete, but she's who I want to be in terms of just being reliable, if you're going to be Christian, that's how you act. And
Clark Gable says it best. She's genuinely the kindest person you've ever met.
Yes, like, of all the, the so-called Christian women around who are judging the one prostitute who wants to donate to the cause, she wants to donate her money, and they're like, no, your money's no good here. And Melanie's the only one who treats her like a human, or the only woman who treats her like a human, because Clark Gable also has a soft spot for her. But it's fascinating how Melanie's character just she's not fazed or threatened at all by Scarlett, even though she's totally chasing after her man, and everyone's talking about it. Melanie's just, I can't even form my thoughts right now, because I loved her character so much as a contrast to Scarlett's.
Yeah, their relationship is fascinating, and I love that in the story they end up stuck together, and it's just, Scarlett in a lot of ways didn't have a lot of choices. Like, she was forced to deal with a lot of things that she didn't want to deal with, and she also put herself into situations where she had to deal with a lot of things that she didn't want to deal with. But that was really interesting, and they're back to Scarlett and dealing with the Civil War and being a nurse. They really did a good job of the scale of damage and injury. Like, the picture behind you, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can see Vasti's screen, or her background is like Atlanta on fire.
And cinematically, by the way, I saw this on the big screen at the Egyptian Theater. That was my first time watching it a few years ago. And the burning of Atlanta was one of my favorite scenes, just because of the scope of it. And then just having to remind myself, oh my God, this is 1939. Like, the effects of... So, actually, interesting fact
I think you're about to say the exact thing I was going to say. Go.
Well, go ahead. Here we go. So the Atlanta fire scenes were just old movie sets that were being burnt down, and that actually included the 1933 set of King Kong.
Yes. So it was filmed. It was one of the first things to be filmed because they decided if a major mistake happened, they could scrap the film. 'Cause it cost like $25,000 to burn this, and apparently the fire was so big at the MGM studios because they were just like, they had to get a bunch of old sets out of the way, like you said, like King Kong. There's a couple other ones like the Garden of Allah and some other stuff, but apparently the fire was so intense that like the city
Neighbors.
residents, Culver City, like they're jamming the phone lines, like MGM's burning down. It was like such an intense fire, but I thought it was interesting they filmed that first because I was thinking like they burnt sets down. You'd think they'd film that last, but I guess they were like, okay, well if this sucks, then we can back out of the film before we spend a bunch of money.
No, same with you. Like I would have assumed that that's the last thing you'd film.
And while we're on backgrounds, yeah, definitely. While we're on backgrounds really quick, if you can see my background is, I found actually a Thomas Kincaid.
I was about to say that is so Thomas Kincaid.
Yeah, he's done a lot of like, I didn't know this, but there's a lot of movie, like there was a Mulan one and
I know he does a lot of Disney, yeah.
So, and there's, like if I move, you can see Scarlett and Rhett in the background. But this is Tara. Like it's a Thomas Kincaid painting of Tara.
So it's a romanticization of a romanticized.
Exactly, and then you're burning it all down. So we got both sides of the spectrum. It's perfect.
Yeah, so it's funny. So back to Scarlett, how she's really, when you deconstruct her, like she's really the anti-Southern Belle, even though she appears to be a Southern Belle, but as her character arc progresses, she becomes basically the anti-Southern Belle. She's insisting on running businesses and does what she needs to do. And before she, when things were really dire, like she was doing the work. She was out in the field. She was out getting her hands dirty to do what she needed to do. Even though fragments of her spoiled self would come out, she was doing the work.
Yeah, and which like you said,
really fascinating because I hate her, but I'm still watching.
Yeah, this movie, I was a little daunted, especially like I said, my first experience watching this. It was like the longest, most excruciating experience. So I was a little hesitant to go into this, and I thought I was going to have to watch it in pieces. I was like, I knew there was an intermission at 2 hours. And I actually just found myself, I watched the whole thing. It was, as much as I was uncomfortable with things, or there was a lot of like, that's a little icky. I was definitely enthralled with the movie. I was in it. I was fascinated by it. It was fascinating to watch. And I just, all of a sudden it was over, like the whole movie. It was really interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't realize I didn't remember anything about it really, except like the famous things you see all the time.
Right.
It takes place over 12 years of her life. So it's just really, it's a really interesting film. And it doesn't feel like it's 4 hours long, honestly.
No, not at all. So going back to what we were talking about with the concern of the portrayal of African Americans in this film. So Selznick reportedly promised to be sensitive to leaders of the NAACP. So what he interpreted that as, you don't hear the use of the N-word in this. You do hear the term darkies thrown around, which is still very cringe, but so I think with a film like this, and then I keep drawing parallels to the Disney Song of the South, I just feel like these were Southern glorification films that just wanted to have it both ways. They weren't going to really take a stand against stereotypes and glossing over the horrendous treatment of, where, yes, it's true, not every single plantation had these large-scale overseers and hundreds of slaves. But that's not to say that wasn't the... It wasn't the exception. This wasn't the exception. a plantation of this size would have had hundreds of slaves who were mistreated. And I think you can't tell a film like this without willing to compromise that you're just not, you're gonna romanticize, you're gonna make it seem like these were the good old days. And I think that's what those two films have in common, is that they don't talk about, especially in the post-Civil War era of Reconstruction, it was absolutely terrible with, you know, the rise of the KKK and the loss of rights, and I think it's really important to talk about why it's so upsetting to many people that this is not an accurate portrayal of the time in terms of what happened to the slave during and after the Civil War. You see Hattie McDaniel's kind of, you know, still sassy but still loyal. You see, you know, what's his name? The one who ends up down by the river.
He's like Big Sam or Big Tom.
Big Sam, I believe. Like yes. That. Yeah. So it's everyone still remaining very loyal, and there's no character development with them. I understand it's not their story, but it is a problematic portrayal.
Yeah, I think it's glossed over is really the thing. Like you said, it's not their story, but in the background, it's very lightheartedly discussed, and you know they do have the way they refer to slaves, like you said, darkies and other things, and just like, oh, you know them, they're kind of dumb, is like the vibe you get when they're talking about Prissy,
or even the father, who she's like, I don't like how you're talking to them. You need to be superior, because Scarlett was getting a little too chummy with, or you know, treating them. There's actually one line I did really like of hers. I'm paraphrasing, but she says, you know, like, I'm not asking them to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. And for me, I felt like that was the beginning of her growth.
Definitely. Hey, I have a question from a historical standpoint. During the film, like during the Reconstruction era, so this is right after the Civil War, they talk a lot about carpetbaggers, and I didn't have time to research what that is. I was wondering if you could give us a rundown of what that is.
So carpetbaggers and scalawags are something that you would hear. They're derogatory terms. So a carpetbagger was a derogatory term by the Confederate side, who basically describes a northerner who goes south just to profit from Reconstruction, so just to buy land. It's basically seen as an opportunist who doesn't care about the South. He's just gonna, you know. So, do you remember in the one scene when, oh God, what was his name? Who comes in his carriage and he's like, I'm offering to buy Tara.
It was somebody Wilkes or something. Not Wilkes. I can't remember his name, but he was kind of portrayed as a bad guy in the very first scene where like he had knocked up a woman and then not. So
for both carpetbaggers and scalawags, they're just opportunists. So a scalawag is just a white Southerner who collaborates with a Northern Republican during Reconstruction. So you could say just seen as a traitor, who flips the side. So Scarlett O'Hara was not one. She pulled herself up from her bootstraps, you know, in the very American,
capitalistic way.
Yeah.
Working your way up the ladder. Yeah.
She worked her way up. She refused to sell out. And
you're interesting. You're talking about carpetbaggers being opportunists, and that makes a lot of sense. And now that I have that context, because in the film, after the war is over, they're these people, and they keep like, oh, these damn Yankees, which is, they're constantly shit talking the damn Yankees. But it's people,
you even see one talking to a group of freemen saying like, oh, we'll promise you 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah, and they're trying to get people, and we'll give you this stuff because we want to be friends and we want you to vote for our side. We want to, take over. But you see, like, that one scene where all the people, all the soldiers are, wounded and trudging back south, and then the carriage comes through with they're well dressed, and it's a white man and a black man, and they're just kind of like, get out of the way, and it's like these terrible Yankees with their money coming through and just disrespecting us and pushing us out of the way. Yeah, it was so strange to see the North depicted that way. But again, this is a Southern sympathizing film. Yeah, it's really interesting, like the interstitial like subtitles or like the title screens that describe the narration, basically.
Right.
It's like the weary South's eye. They look north to the Battle of Gettysburg with tearful eyes or something. It's like it's not a perspective we're used to. Like the North wrote the history stories that we learn in school. So. It's interesting that way.
So for just also a literal context, a carpet bag, just think of Mary Poppins' bag. Like, it's a literal bag made out of a carpet. So it's just, you grab your carpet bag and it's that's where the term came from. They're traveling down south, being as an opportunistic businessman. But it was these weren't in terms of endearment. These were derogatory terms given by the losing side. I mean, let's call it what it is. So going back to my apologies, I lost my place in my notes. Oh, so just what we were talking about, how this film was sold as like a love story, and one scene besides the famous last words, one scene that I knew before I even saw the film was the pink sky in the background, and he's just basically talking right into her face before they kiss. And so one of the very first pieces of trivia I ever learned before watching the movie is that she hated how bad his breath smelled. And so I never forgot that. I always thought that was really funny. But then I read more closely into why he had notorious bad breath, and I didn't know he had lost all his teeth. Like, it was because of
from smoking
his
so much. So I also read that he was kind of a prankster, and he would eat garlic before he'd kiss her just to make it really bad.
On those lines, I also read that he and Hattie McDaniel were good friends, but he would also prank her. So some of the scenes where she would like drink tea, he would, instead of putting water, he'd put cognac.
But she messed with him too, even though her character was like this nice Southern belle. So you know how when they're fleeing from Atlanta to go back
Scarlett,
to Tara? Well, no. So the women, like Rhett comes to rescue them from the house because they're gonna flee to Tara. And you know how Rhett picks her up from the bed? Yeah. Apparently, she had herself tied to the bed, so that when he tried to pick her up, he almost like pulled out his back trying to actually pick her up from the bed. So they were pranking each other during the filming of
That's really funny. That's really funny. I like that. And what's a shame about those old productions is that they would burn their film that they wouldn't use. So like, there's no blooper reels, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, I don't know, I'm sure there's very few blooper reels out there for old films. I've seen some, and they're really entertaining. I'll have to send you some, but I know there's one, like, Jimmy Stewart's, like, says his line, he's walking away, and the camera's following him, and he's like, I didn't know you were gonna do that. There you go. But it's such a Jimmy Stewart kind of way. It's adorable.
That's
You'll
really
love it.
funny. So also, in terms of pop culture and some of the parodies that made me familiar with Gone with the Wind before I even realized it. So the scene where what you were describing when all the soldiers are injured at the train yard, and they just pans out to see, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wounded soldiers. I recognize that from The Simpsons. And for those of you who watch The Simpsons, when they get a trampoline and all the neighborhood kids come and they injure themselves on this trampoline, and it pans out in the exact same way that it does in Gone with the Wind. And I realized, I'm like, oh my god, I've seen this before. That's what they were referencing.
Oh, that's really cool. I had no idea.
Yeah, so I don't know the proper title, but it's the Simpsons trampoline episode that is a carbon copy of that train yard scene from Gone with the Wind.
Oh, that's
and
awesome.
Another fun fact about that scene is that half of those bodies in the train yard are dummies. You just couldn't get enough extra. It was just easier, I think, to get.
Yeah, I was reading about that. It's easier and cheaper. And then also, apparently, there just wasn't enough people because there was 4 other movies being filmed at the exact same time that needed a lot of extras. But that was supposed to be 1,600 soldiers. Or, I read different numbers, different reports, but, at least there was at least 800 dummies mixed in with the people, which I thought that was really cool, too. They just didn't have enough people.
That's really funny.
But apparently there were some 2,400 extras in this film overall.
Wow.
The making of it. But it's the massive scale of this production was amazing. It's like how we talked about Metropolis, just thousands of people coming together to make this film. And there were more than 50 speaking roles in this movie, which is amazing.
Well,
there's a lot of interesting...
early...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. During a lot of the beginning parts of the burning of Atlanta, when it's just chaos, it's just carriages and foot soldiers and slaves. Everybody's kind of intercrossing. You don't know what's going on, and bombs are going off. And all I could think was oh, that must have been a bitch to film. Because how do you do it back then? Okay, everyone back to their place. I don't know the lingo, the set lingo, but all I could think of how difficult it must have been I always think that, but the earlier the film and the bigger the scale, the more in awe I am of how hard that must have been.
Yeah, it's like going back to Ben-Hur or something, just the epic scale of all these people and how do you coordinate them. It's amazing what we did for films. Now we just cheat and use CGI.
And it doesn't, there's a reason why some of these, we'll discuss Ben-Hur on another time, but right now that you just brought it up, I think there's a reason the 2016 version failed is because it just didn't feel authentic.
I didn't even know there was a 2016 version.
Yeah,
so.
Same with the 10 Commandments. I that's another 4-hour epic, but a friend of mine who did see the newest one, I don't remember the year, if it was 2015 or not, said it was too short. You can't tell that kind of story in just 2 hours. So I don't know if that's also what happened with Ben-Hur. So if they were ever to do a Gone with the Wind remake, I would definitely expect them to try to cut corners, CGI it, try to tell a 4-hour film in, an hour and a half. And I think you just lose some of the authenticity. And they just, as cliche as it's going to sound, they just don't make them like that anymore.
Yeah, and they put a lot of money into this film. At the time, the average feature film cost was under $1 million, and they spent 4.2, a little more than, making this film. But according to Guinness Book of World Records, I went on their website because I read somewhere and I wanted the accurate information. But if you adjust for inflation, that this is the highest grossing, overall global box office film of all time, somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.4 billion.
Oh, I have 3.5 billion. So yeah, it's right around there.
But that's an insane amount of money. So it's every year, because of inflation, when movies come out, it's like this is the highest grossing film of all time.
Mm-hmm.
But if you adjust for inflation, this really is an enduringly popular film, and it made a lot of money. And it's amazing that many people saw it, because it's 4 freaking hours long. So it was
probably a lot of people, similar to Titanic, I think a lot of people kept seeing it repeatedly. So an estimated 200 million tickets were sold, and that was not the U.S. population at the time. So I think people were just seeing it repeatedly.
Yeah, I saw Titanic in theaters 8 times.
Oh, wow!
I remember I was like, I don't know, 8 when that film came out, but my dad and I loved it, and I kept wanting to see it again, and he'd take me, and I remember being like, we watched this movie for 24 hours. Saw it 8 times. So I can see that.
We were discussing, right now that you just mentioned Titanic, I'm going to just digress a little bit. I remember with the epic films, you'd get, like, for you kids that don't remember VHS tapes, excuse me, some of these films would be split into 2 videotapes. And I remember exactly, I would only watch the first videotape of Titanic, because the second one was too upsetting for me.
That's awesome. I had the double VHS, but yeah, the first
I would
VHS
only watch the first
like
one.
A lovely, fun film, and the second one is super depressing.
Everyone's dying. Yeah.
I feel you. So going back to the making of this film, it's such a tumultuous filmmaking process. I mean, you had all these writers, even though the one guy
directors.
You had 3 directors, a whole bunch of writers. They did a bunch of rewrites, 2 years of pre-production, all this money. Where am I going with this? Oh, so after all this, when they finished filming, there was like 88 hours of footage.
I believe it, because I also
edited.
I read that originally they ended up with like 500,000 feet of film.
And my goodness!
Like the uncut, what you just described. That's how much they had, but the final cut of the movie measured to 20,000 feet of film.
Wow, that's amazing. Still to this day, it's the longest running of all motion pictures to win Academy Award for Best Picture. It was the first color film to win Best Picture.
That's interesting. I didn't know that about the longest running.
Oh, and also, you know how they won 8 Academy Awards, and then they won 2 like honorary Academy Awards. It was you talked about it.
The technical
award the technical awards, like William Cameron Menzies won for his use of color to enhance the mood of the production, and then Scientific and Technical Achievement Award to R.D. Musgrave for developing the equipment that allowed for the creation of visual effects with 3 strip Technicolor equipment. So he created that. But so for years, Selznick and MGM, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, they were like, oh, we won 10 Academy Awards, when in fact it wasn't until West Side Story in 1961 that would go on to be the first film to win 10 Academy Awards. But even now, all the video releases of Gone with the Wind say, in quotes, like, winner of 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. So they still tout that as we won 10.
Even though technically they won the 8 and then the 2 additional ones. That's really funny. I mean, it's all about marketing when you really get down to it.
Exactly. You just gotta...
But now that we're speaking numbers, there's something that, it was very... You want to talk about something that was very of the time and still relevant. And something that kind of, upset me. So Clark Gable made about $120,000 from this film, while Vivian Leigh, who was in this movie a lot longer, shot almost double the amount of time, so well over 100 days. She only made $25,000.
Yeah, I saw that. That's absolutely crazy. And she was, it was almost 3 hours of film with her in it. Like 2, I forget the exact number, but it was close to 3 hours, above 240. And she's That's the longest performance on film for Best Actress, and she only made $25,000 when he made 120. That's insane.
And look, like, I get it. He was the more established star at the time, but still, I mean, even to this day, I still hear of these young actors that make just pennies compared to that carry the film compared to some of their co-stars, and it's something I'm really never gonna understand. The business side of it is, I mean, I still can't help but think that's not fair. She carries this film. She won. She got the recognition she deserved, but I mean, that's a huge pay difference.
Yeah, but I mean, that's women's rights for you, and how women weren't respected in the film industry, and it's still a struggle. It's definitely improved, but equal pay.
I mean, it's improved, but at the snail pace. Like, from then to now, I feel it should be a lot further along, but, you know, that's another discussion, I think, for another time. Because I want to get into some chisme, and for those of you who don't know, that's gossip in Spanish.
Ooh,
I read that Clark Gable basically had an affair, got a divorce, and eloped with Carol Lombard during a break in production. So during the entire filming of this, he changed his life and eloped with this other famous actress. And funny enough, so did Vivian Leigh. She had an affair and ended up marrying Laurence Olivier during the production of this film.
Yeah, she was like trying to work extra hours and like, let's work late because she wanted to go. He was filming somewhere else and she wanted to go be with him. And that was also rumored that that's how she ended up with the part also. Because he was just kind of like, hey, she should be Scarlett. So I read that somewhere too, but more consistently was the story about how she was chosen first. But maybe that's how she was an unknown. But if Laurence Olivier is like, hey, you should make her the lead in your movie, you might really pay attention to that.
And honestly, that's kind of my stereotypical view of Hollywood back in the day. It was easier to know somebody. I mean, that's how I play it in my head. If TVs and movies have taught me anything, that's how conversations happened back in the day.
Oh yeah, it's all about who you know and who you sleep with, and yeah, that's the underbelly of Hollywood right there. I mean, hopefully things are changing, but if the Me Too movement was any indication, it hadn't really. And it was men, women, everybody's getting taken advantage of. Like, what dick are you sucking to get this job? Basically,
yeah, I mean, yes, you're not wrong. So, in terms of political incorrectness, this film is full of them. However, in a weird way, I still think the film holds up. Not in terms of characters necessarily or certain portrayals, but I think it's just a good story from beginning to end. It flows really well. Even if you don't think you're into, period pieces or historical drama, it's a fascinating story. And even if you don't want to read into or look into the historical accuracies or inaccuracies of the time, I just think it's a good banter story, like a back and forth. So a long time ago when we were talking about It Happened One Night, you asked me if my view of Clark Gable was going to change, because I had previously mentioned that I really didn't like him as an actor. It was just one of those things. It wasn't really based on anything, just some people rub you the wrong way and some don't. Oh my God, I loved him in this, this time around. And I think it has to do with how it influenced me, how his character in It Happened One Night influenced my viewing for this. Like, all the sass he gave back to Scarlett was just like, yes,
It was it was very reminiscent of It Happened One Night. I thought about that too when I was watching it. It's hard not to make the parallel between the characters. While Rhett Butler is very much more like a scoundrel than the good-hearted, can't remember his name, but the guy in It Happened One Night. They're very similar at their base of how they talk to people, and that was his roguish charm. That's what made him successful as an actor. Mm-hmm. That was his character.
And not to say I'm willing to, forgive a certain scene that he's very much responsible for in between him and Scarlett, which was, it was hard to watch, even though it's not very blatant. It's implied.
Are you talking about the one that I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that scene in the trailer?
Yes.
I kind of want to touch on that really quick.
Yes.
Because you're right, it is very implied, but it was very upsetting that, and this is kind of spoilers, but there's a moment where, he's drunk and they're arguing, and he's basically like, I'm taking you upstairs, like you're not going to put me aside. And right now, like I'm taking, he literally picks her up and takes her upstairs, and I was just like, oh my! But then it cuts to like the next
her
morning,
being like,
and that was really upsetting. I was like, oh great, so he rapes her, like spousal rape, and then she's happy in love with him the next morning because it was romantic, and that really was really upsetting for perpetuating that kind of behavior, that like toxic masculinity is romantic in some way or another, because that's what it is. It's romanticized, that kind of
because it also shows
dominance.
Like, he had been saying throughout the film, like, you basically just need some good loving.
Yeah, you just need someone to kiss you, like, that knows how to kiss you, that knows how, and he's kind of forceful with her, and that's supposed to be romantic. And as much as like that kind of bothered me with their love affair, is that like, it was a reminder that it's not that long ago that this was still okay, and we thought of this as romantic, and now we're really starting to be like, or that perpetuate the stereotype that that's the way we treat women.
And also just that it was, you think about even before the 1920s, if you really want to put yourself in that time period, spousal rape wasn't a thing. Like, no, that was just you're his wife. You do whatever your husband wants. Like,
you're his property, and you do what he wants. Her standing up to him at all was her being, uppity.
No, so that's what really I can imagine as a filmmaker, you have to break up the super sad, super upsetting scenes with some comedic relief or just some sort of contrast. Those of you who are writers, I hope you know what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure what the transition is called, but, seeing it with modern eyes, and you see, just the implication of what just happened, and then an immediate cut to her, like, implying that she's completely, in love and satisfied, and he gave her exactly what she needed, I don't know how that went over at the time. This is clearly written by a man back then, and, it's hard to imagine.
I feel like it was very typical of the time. I don't think it was a question of how well that went over. I don't think anybody thought of that as being inappropriate.
Or I would think of certain women who have experienced that. I would imagine would be triggered, even though they couldn't say anything. They didn't have the outlet to speak out about it. I wouldn't say everybody thought that it was, I know what you mean. Like, it was normal. It was more normal back then, but I'm sure that several people who did see it in real time didn't necessarily feel that what the film was trying to do of just
yeah, it was probably you're right.
Okay,
it was probably a very
I mean?
triggering experience for some people to watch it, but
and not know how to really express that.
Right,
and now we do have those outlets, but
right, the term even like a triggering experience or understanding that you had some trauma.
It's very new, yeah.
It wasn't considered trauma. Like the feelings that you're having of it being upsetting you're told that that's wrong. That so those aren't correct feelings to have. Yeah, so it's always been a very conflicting situation anyway. So I'm sure it was challenging to watch because you don't know how you feel about it, and I'm glad we're making progress, but
yeah. And so going back to my definition of does this movie hold up, I think it's still entertaining enough where what you were saying, the 4 hours just kind of flew by. I mean, it's hard to take an unsympathetic character, a completely problematic storytelling of the Confederate point of view, and still find it completely
fascinating,
and it flowed, and
it's almost like morbidly fascinating. Like, where is this going, and what is happening? And it's
I mean,
interesting.
For me, going back to what you said at the very beginning of this podcast, it's a very confusing viewing experience in terms of all the feels that I'm feeling, everything I'm trying to process of like, I hate her, I hate them, I hate their life, fuck them, but at the same time, I'm still
really understanding where they're coming from and their motivation, and like, man, that really sucks for them. Yeah, it's very conflicting. Hey, did you know? With
that said,
Oh no, go ahead, because I was going to change the subject, so you finish.
Go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, did you know Gary Cooper was the first choice for Rhett Butler?
I did, and I forgot. Until you just mentioned it right now. I did read that.
I guess they just couldn't. They were struggling. I think they struggled with getting Gary Cooper anyway. Or, I mean, not Gary Cooper, Clark Gable. Because everyone, at the time, the studio system, everyone's under contract with somebody.
Right.
And as we talked about, and it happened one night, like, studios didn't really loan out Clark Gable or Gary Cooper.
Right.
But Gary Cooper was like, this movie's gonna suck, and I'm glad it's gonna be him going down and not me. So it was really interesting. Like, he did not want anything to do with it. Also, see, I remember...
Good for him, but also whoops.
Yeah. I mean, so that's the second movie. Clark Gable was, like, not down to do the two best movies of his career. But...
Did we already talk about how he didn't want to do the crying scene?
Oh, no.
How he almost walked out. I read he almost walked out because he was at such odds during this one scene where he breaks down.
But that was that was my favorite moment of him acting. Like, I remember it cut to him, and I was like, I mean, it hit me hard. I was like, oh, damn, he looks terrible.
You feel like he regretted everything that had happened up to that point. And not that I was going to forgive him, per se, but, like, yeah, you felt it. You felt what he was going through at that moment. But I read that he insisted on not being shown crying because he thought it was a woman's film, it was a woman's sentiment, blah blah. And so they filmed it twice. They filmed that cut, and then they filmed it with his dialogue with his back to the camera, so you couldn't see him crying.
Interesting.
And so
he seems like he was very concerned about his masculinity, because he actually, like, I read he wore lifts when he was filming this so he'd be taller. So he had this, like, machismo that he was trying to live up to. He didn't want to cry or be too...
Well, now it makes me think back to the rumors of, like, what was he trying to make up for instead of just kind of owning it. So It makes me think of, like, oh, maybe the rumors are true, where he was just trying to overdo it and overcompensate.
But he might have been gay, and he was trying to...
Or bi or something, yeah.
Yeah, well, like I said, there were rumors that he was, him and George Cougar had been kind of running around in the same circles. So, you know, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many men that are, and women too, but there's so many people that are at least bisexual, but you know, historically it's been so frowned upon that it's, you know, closeted and shameful that there, I mean, I'm sure there's thousands of famous people that, you know.
Well, immediately I'm thinking of Rock Hudson, and I know this isn't our Ben-Hur discussion, but like, he was told not to take that part because there was enough homoeroticism in Ben-Hur that they're like, no, you don't need the extra attention. Don't take the part.
Because he
like,
was
oh,
gay.
that's really
he was gay, right?
Yeah.
But he didn't come out until much later, I believe. Oh, I know you love Alfred Hitchcock. Did you read about him in this film?
No, tell me.
Okay, I found this and I thought you'd be really excited because I know you love Alfred Hitchcock. So David O. Selznick, the producer, asked Alfred Hitchcock for help with the scene in which, you know, the women are waiting for the men and they're sitting there sewing, and
it's really tense, actually. Yeah,
and Matt is like reading from David Copperfield, and so Hitchcock delivered a very precise treatment. Like, there's descriptions of, like, the looks between the women, and then you, like, see them, the Union soldiers waiting outside, and, like, this meaningful glances and all this stuff, and then, which would have been so cool, and then virtually none of it was used for the film. So Alfred Hitchcock almost got his finger in there, which would have been perfect for that scene, because it's really intense.
I was gonna say,
Alfred Hitchcock-like.
It's a really tense moment. And, like, I would never thought I'd be tensing up for Confederate women sitting in a fire sewing, but it was a really tense moment. And I felt the tension. I felt what was at stake. I really liked that scene, and it would have been amazing to have seen what Hitchcock's interpretation of that would have been. That's fascinating.
I thought you'd be excited about that. The last thing I had was that I remember this being in the news recently. But did you know Olivia de Havilland died July 26th of 2020? Yes. She was 104.
Number one, I love her. I think she's one of the most beautiful people on the planet. And that she almost married Jimmy Stewart. Like, basically
the cutest.
What broke them up was the war. Because he had to go away, and I mean, I'm sure there's more to the story, but she ended up marrying somebody else. I'm like, oh, Olivia. But yeah, Olivia de Havilland was 104.
Oh yeah, I read that the guy who played Ashley, like, he went to go be like a spy during World War II, and he was shot down in a plane during the war. I read that somewhere too.
Didn't read that. Oh my goodness.
It's really sad. But yeah, he was like, he went and joined up, but he was a spy. So he was in there.
Well,
that's all I had.
Same. I mean, this is just a film that keeps on giving. Like, I'm sure we could talk another few hours with more digging, and the entire thing's just fascinating. And like I said, even though this isn't necessarily a go-to film for me, it's not a favorite that I keep watching over and over, but it's something that as a moviegoer, if you're a fan of cinema, I think it's something you should watch at least once.
Absolutely. There's a certain list of movies that you need to watch to understand film history and, you know,
and history in general, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but like Metropolis, definitely on that list of, you know, film history movies you need to watch. This one, Casablanca, Citizen Kane is a whole nother topic that I know is number one on everybody's list, but I'm kind of not really into that one. But anyway, that's a topic for a different day.
Yeah, so so I think next time we're just gonna we'll just have a surprise discussion on the next film.
Or I mean, why don't we pick something now? I mean, like,
real quick.
So think of a movie on your list that you've been dying to watch. We don't have to have a topic, or maybe when you pick one, I'll pick one that maybe goes along with it. What do you think?
I mean, in terms of, you know, with the fall season coming up, and in terms of Halloween and horror, like real horror. It's not on my list, but it's been on my I've always wanted to watch. I've always wanted to watch a classic horror film like Nosferatu.
Ooh.
I know it's super old. It's always on like these top lists, and I'm like, I kind of want to watch that. Also, I mean, you brought up Hitchcock. I love Vertigo. I love Rear Window. Any Hitchcock. I could talk about Hitchcock all day. Psycho, The Birds. You pick. You know, honestly, I am down for it. I mean, as long as...
Okay, so I love Nosferatu, so we're definitely watching that.
Okay.
And then, I'm gonna actually have you pick, because I know, I think both of these are on your list, is Vertigo and Rear Window, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and also Psycho, right?
You know what? Let's go with Psycho.
Because it's a classic. It's like...
As much as I love
quintessential Alfred Hitchcock is Psycho.
As much as I love Rear Window, I think that's more of a thriller, not so much just straight. You know, I'm gonna go horror leaning, and I'll pick Psycho.
Okay, so
there we go.
You know, Psycho. Let's do it.
And for those of you who have listened, I think you could figure out that we forgot to discuss the next film.
Live and in person, our decision making. Welcome.
Well, please make sure to check us out on moviemenupodcast.com and also follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's Movie Menu Podcasts with an S. So until next time,
stay classy.